Clinical case Maryam, Psychosomatics. Description. Maryam, a Qatari woman, 58 years old, comes into therapy with a symptom of paraplegia, lower body paralysis. And she noticed that her condition worsened after a very specific intersubjective situation, after her husband has raised the question of marrying the second wife. She didn't understand why this happened to her, and her condition remained a big question to her. What meaning does her state have? Why did the aggravation occur after a specific situation? How to understand the vicissitudes of paralysis without any medical reason. Symptoms: paraplegia, lower body paralysis. Maryam was not able to move her both legs, hips, and the organs in the lower abdomen where the uterus is. She had visible signs of muscle atrophy. Anamnesis: no severe physical disease or mental disease running in her family. Request was addressed from the side of her children who wanted their mom to be able to walk again. About family. When she was a teen, her family arranged her marriage with a guy from a neighboring tribe. She has not had any life experience outside her father's house and later her husband's house. She almost never leaves home, only in a case of rare necessity. Now she is a mother of 11 grown-up children, and her family is all she has. Maryam is shaped up by the network of family relationships inside which she is a leader. Her family ties are woven into the rich and complex fabric of hierarchical relationships and family structure, which determine her organic dependence on the family. She doesn't exist separately from the family, like any other Muslim woman. So the modification of her family environment is perceived by her as the modification of her body. About the other. The other is either knowledgeable, the controlling one, like a husband, or the one who she controls, like children or servants. About relation to body. The family structure has been strongly incorporated into her body, where the legs symbolize the foundation upon which the structure is based. Her attitude to the body was as if it didn't belong to her. I have never noticed her being in touch with her body. These were her kids who would sit around her and hold her hands, stroke her forehead, massage her feet. Even when a doctor was making ultrasound, she was totally disinterested in what was going on the screen. On the contrary, these were the kids who were glued to the monitor, and not her. And as if it was okay in general for the kids to be interested more in her body than herself. So she was experiencing the fall of her foundation, her position in family. About transfer. I was put on the place of the knowledgeable one, the one who assigns the place to her. I occupied the place of her father, her husband in transfer. Clinical picture. Since the therapy was taking place at her home, the first thing that strikes when you enter the house is a 3-meter painting hanging on the wall, in the middle of which there is her and her husband and their children and great-grandchildren around them. But let us come back to the question of the place of the unconscious in the somatization of this clinical case. The emergence of corporal illness was a call for the knowledge with which she could have been able to respond to the impossible real. Her corporal processes had to respond to a conflictual situation. However, the corporal effects of subjectivation of the real at one point failed. Here the legs have a relation to the narcissism of a subject. The image of the body plays a structuring role for the identity of the subject. Her identity and therefore narcissism were struck. The real of the body modified in paraplegia and often forgotten in favor of imaginary and symbolic instances, and they had all its importance for her. It is to be linked with the image of the body, the emergence of which coincides with the advent of the subject's identity. I shall repeat that her identity was her family. The question of personal identity brings back the issue of her own body when it was necessary to link the bodily criteria to the physical identity, so that to maintain the I, which finds its anchorage in her own body. Maryam felt rejected, thrown aside and misunderstood. Her difficulties are organized around the place that the other can attribute to her. She was literally saying, "No one loves me anymore." Paradoxically, she cannot do without this presence and this constant reminder of a link that still exists with the other. Through her repeated requests, Maryam manifests ambiguity between omnipotence and helplessness, between radical control of her environment and her total dependence on it, thus positioning herself in both omnipotence and total impotence. She examines the place which she occupies for the other, for her husband. Taking a second wife meant that the other woman would take control of her husband, her home, and therefore herself. Analytical work. First of all, it was necessary to take into account the place of the legs in the relation I and the other. They relate to the real, which is difficult to conceptualize. Somatization appeared where the phantasm didn't support her. It is a corporeal product that avoids the unconscious. I have explored the subjective status of the demens signifiers. The subjective place of the disease determines its categorization. In view of the subjective implication in the demand, that is to say, when the illness becomes a sign of a supposed knowledge addressed to the analyst, it is necessary to start by talking about a symptom of her protest against husband's decision. The immediate response would be to distinguish the place of the unconscious in the construction of the symptom. Lacan's idea is to link the psychosomatic effects to the subject's difficulties in registration inside the signifying chain. As of psychosomatics was that something inscribed in the body. The body functioned in her case like a diary. By exploring the specific enjoyment that was at stake, her psychosomatics signified the subject's relations with her environment. The work consisted of reappropriating her place in the structure, the place of identification, where psychosomatic phenomena were deeply rooted in the imagination at the level of the passage to the symbolic. Maryam was having a hard time talking about her protest against the second marriage and getting back to psychic movement. And the protest suddenly got stuck in the body and needed a place to show up, to speak out, to manifest itself. The subject was confronted with the temporary loss of mobility of the body's parts. She faced the unreal, which would be more correct to name too much of the real, in the sense of Freud, who conceives the real as an instance of trauma. Confronting the inexorable loss could have led the patient to self-destruction and annihilation. To tame the reality, we had to reconnect it with the register of words, the register of symbolic through the imaginary. The notion of the immobilization of thought seems to be accountable for the impossibility of elaboration in Maryam's case, which had to be integrated and lived on a more subjectified level of experience. For the analyst, it was a matter of being there as close as possible to the patient's experience in support of her subjective involvement. The work was done on the texture of the bonds that connected Maryam to family and to herself. The role of the analyst also consisted in favoring a subjective reappropriation of this movement, optimizing patients' capacities of symbolization and creation. It is important to distinguish, first of all, psychosomatic symptom from a hysteric symptom. In this case, her psychosomatic symptom required subjectivation by the subject, which explains the appeal to the analyst. It was not a hysterical symptom constructed with the signifier and the mechanism of the unconscious, such as condensation and displacement. Secondly, psychosomatic symptom should be distinguished from the neurotic symptom. In the psychosomatics, there is a process of direct inscription without going through the dialectic of desire and the unconscious, taken at the symbolic level. What helped? First of all, verbalization of her fears of losing power inside the family, which would turn her into unwanted and unneeded one. Talking has made it possible to re-establish the family game, to re-establish a space of freedom, and it is always a movement of separation from what is being said. Secondly, encouragement of her ability to think, create, elaborate, and therefore go into psychic movement. She has found her new place in the family, which also means to be able to move forward. Changes which has occurred during the analysis. In 2 years, she managed to regain partial control over the affected muscles. She started having a feeling that life is worth living beyond a relationship of submissive indulgence to outer reality.